Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Hedlund, and this is the 5th of our Contractor Success webinar series of this series of presentations. Today's presentation is Permanent versus Temporary Labor Impact on Bottom Line and Human Resource Strategies. We have two very good speakers today. The first will be Howard Cox. I'm going to give a quick introduction of Howard Cox, and then when Howard finishes presenting his topic, which is human resource deadly sins, we will also then bring some outside experts, Ryan Ellis and Ryan Boyer of PLS of Indiana, to speak on permanent versus temporary labor impact, and I will introduce them at that time. So briefly, Howard is with Somerset CPAs. He is the director of our business advisory team. He joined our firm in December of 2001, and prior to joining our firm, Howard was the director of operations for a large real estate developer. With Somerset, he focuses on business consulting engagements, corporate training sessions, and public speaking. He provides corporate training on a wide range of subjects. I suspect many of you have had exposure to Howard over the years. His topics include business development, customer service, and management and leadership. He is also the author of the blog, Somerset Success Strategies. In addition to being a certified public accountant, Howard is also a certified management accountant and a certified internal auditor. So with that introduction, I'm going to let Howard present the first topic for today, which is human resources deadly sins.
Thank you, Ken. Welcome everybody to the call, and appreciate your participation. Wanted to take just a minute and kind of frame up why are we talking about these human resource deadly sins. Essentially, generally the goal that we have as owners and managers is that we want to develop a sustainable, high-performing organization. And when we think about that, one of the realizations that we need to have is that a high-performing organization is almost like a misnomer in that organizations don't perform. So if you're going to have a high-performance organization, it's going to have to be made up of high-performance individuals. That's how you end up with a high-performance organization. And so how can you end up with these high-performance individuals and enough of them to where you can create a high-performance organization? And you can really only accomplish that if you excel in at least 5 areas. There's probably other areas, but 5 critical areas. One of them is you consistently have to bring the right talent on board. Obviously, those are the raw materials, so you're going to have difficulty ending up with high-performing talent if you're not getting the right raw materials in the first place. Number 2, you're going to have to rigorously and judiciously manage talent, because no matter how good you are at bringing in the right talent, you're going to make mistakes, or people are going to change over time, and so you have to be very rigorous and diligent about removing underperformers. Because they're the opposite of high performers, and so they are defeating your purposes. So you've got to bring in the right talent. You've got to remove the underperformers. 3, as your business grows, as you have normal turnover, for whatever reasons, when you need to replace management level people in your organization, you've got to make sure, you've got to ensure that you are promoting the right individuals into the right positions based on the correct criteria. So you've really got to make sure that this management succession plan internally is executed correctly. 4th, and very closely related to promoting the right talent, is that you need to make sure that you are vigorously coaching and mentoring your team in a correctly and consistently and predictably and reliably in real time, because that's really your talent pipeline, so that you can then have those right people ready to step into those positions that are created either because of growth or normal turnover retirements in any organization. And then lastly, number 5, you really have to protect your best players from themselves, because a lot of what makes people your highest performers, the very nature of those kinds of people will have them sometimes be their own worst enemy and take on too much and have too many responsibilities, and doing that over a long period of time can lead to burnout and implosion, and can be very detrimental to your organization. So those are the 5 fundamental building blocks of creating high-performance individuals that can then result in a high-performing organization. And when we learn, a lot of the ways I've at least been able to successfully learn, and something I think is very instructive, is that if you know what you want to do, you want to be able to do these 5 things, sometimes it's good to be able to learn from what you need to stop doing. So what we're really going to be looking is what are some common mistakes that people make that frustrate or impede being able to do these 5 things very well. So we're going to learn what to do by learning what not to do. And certainly, as we look at these 5 common errors, these are not, it's not to say that every organization on this call makes these errors or would make all of these errors. Obviously, the more high-performing and the more consistently high-performing your organization is, the more of these you've probably already remediated and learned. But I think it's still instructive, regardless of whether you are currently or even have been previously guilty of these types of things. I think it's still instructive. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. The only other quick note that I'll make is that this same set of materials that we're going to be reviewing here in a little less than 60 minutes, I've sometimes presented in as much as maybe a half a day kind of workshop. So just to kind of set expectations, what we're going to do is provide basically a high-level overview, and then you have all of the materials that you can then delve into deeper on your end as would be appropriate based on what is relevant to your organization. So in many ways, it's probably better to see this information as a high-level overview in roughly an hour, and that way we don't get too in-depth into areas that may not apply to your organization, but yet we believe we've given you the resources and materials with which to be able to go deeper as is appropriate in your facts and circumstances. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into, those are kind of the 5 overall human resource sins that are the antithesis of what it is that we're trying to create. So let's jump right into the hiring sin. Fundamentally, when we really look at the hiring sin, one of the basic faults or failure points, dead alleys that we run down, is that we sometimes are in too much of a hurry when we hire. Typically we're hiring because we have a need. We have a need, and so we're trying to fill that need as quickly as we possibly can. In theory, that makes very logical sense, and certainly we want to fill those positions as quickly as we reasonably can, but it is far more important that we fill that position with a quality player versus just finding kind of the first available person that meets the minimum criteria. So we kid that, sometimes we use the fog to mirror test, as a hiring criteria, or that we will sometimes assume that if we're down people, that bringing somebody in is going to be better than being down a person or two, when really we've found out the hard way that that's really generally not the case. You're better off to just tough it out until you can find the right people. When we jump further now into a little bit more detail, so as like a 50,000-foot type of mistake that we can make is really filling the position too quickly, being too quick to fill the position. Now, a secondary cause can be that we really hired from the wrong pool of candidates in the first place. So theoretically, you can go through a process and you can feel really good about the fact that you hired the best person that you interviewed. And although there's something to be said for that, and certainly congratulations for hiring the best person that you saw, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you hired the best person for the position. You may have never gotten a look at some real talent that you needed to get a look at. So we're going to look at some of the reasons why, or some of the ways we can guard against that here in a minute. Secondly, or thirdly, we may end up with a bad hire because we didn't really perform either any pre-screening in some cases, or at least not efficient or rigorous or appropriate enough pre-screening. So we ended up, obviously, even if you're getting the right kind of people in, even if you're taking your time, you're conducting an interview, you're maybe spending an hour with the person, even if you have them back for a second interview or even a third, and you have some other people in the organization interview them, still, no matter what you do, you're going to be making an incredibly important decision based on a relatively small snapshot of that person, and many people can fool you for relatively short periods of time. And I don't care how good you are and how good your instincts are, at least from my experience, you can be fooled, and through the correct type of pre-screening process, you can flesh out some of these people that look good, smell good, but really can't perform or won't perform. A fourth fundamental building block of a bad hire is the structure of those interviews themselves. One of the things that we alluded to is no matter how you go about this, you're going to have a relatively brief interface with these individuals in terms of deciding on your hiring. And so what you do with that very limited time and how you decide on spending it is going to have a lot to do with the ROI that you get out of that interview process. So those are four fundamental types of things that lead to a bad hire. If you kind of do a post-mortem of a bad hire, typically it's going to be some combination of we were in too big of a hurry, we didn't really get the kind of caliber of talent that we really wanted to get, somebody fooled us, or because we didn't do some pre-screening, or because we really didn't conduct a properly structured, rigorous type of interview process. So let's look at some ways we can counterbalance some of those common types of missteps. And to even take a step back, why do these missteps occur? And typically they occur because for many organizations, hiring is really not a core competency. Every organization has core competencies. There's things that we really excel at. That's why we're in business. That's why we've stayed in business. That's why we've been successful. And typically, hiring isn't one of them. We may not hire people every day. We may not hire people every week. And so it just simply isn't one of our core competencies. Now, sometimes people will say, well, we've got an HR director. You may or may not. A lot of organizations don't. But even if you do, I would say don't let that fool you and that you pay lip service or kind of token to, okay, now we have a hiring core competency. Because typically, even if that person has a hiring core competency, there's obviously going to be other people involved in that hiring process. And so one person's core competency doesn't create an organizational core competency. So one of the ways that we believe that the paradigm that you've got to change, to the extent that any of these have been organizational problems for you, is that if you don't have a core competency, you really need to elicit outside assistance that has that core competency. Now, in some cases, depending on the size of your organization, maybe it makes sense to onboard that core competency over time, but in most cases, it's really going to make more sense to utilize another organization that already has that as a core competency when needed, as needed. So you really generally in the small to mid-market are going to be looking outside of your organization for professionals that this is their core competency. So what types of core competencies would these types of organizations have? Well, at a minimum, they would typically be much more experts than we are about the employment search itself. One of the common failure points we talk about was that we may not hire from the right pool of candidates. Well, there is magic, and I'm not going to get into the details of this because for one reason I'm not an expert in it, but I can tell you from experience there is magic to the placement of that job opening from start to finish, the way that job opening is worded, where it is circulated, both in online and in print, internally to your organization, externally. There's a tremendous amount of magic to virtually every word in that job placement and in every avenue in terms of being able to market that job placement. Secondly, there is if you just do a web search of pre-employment screening, there is any number of pre-screening platforms out there, and knowing which ones to use and which ones to use for which hire. There's not only a tremendous amount of pre-screening options, there's a tremendous array of costs of them. Which ones do you use and in which situations? When do you use them in the process? Do you pre-screen before you interview? Do you pre-screen after you interview? There is a real science and art to all of these decisions, of which dramatically impact your success rate. The interview itself, we're believers in a very structured interview process with predetermined questions that you are going to ask. Some questions which you may ask of every candidate, some questions that are going to be relevant just to that specific position, and that you make sure that you have multiple people that are interviewing using that same basic structured interview criteria, and then that you're trading your experiences to see whether or not, almost like, I don't want to give the wrong impression, it's almost like a police interrogation where you have multiple detectives asking the same questions. You compare notes and see if you're getting consistent responses. Pathological liars again, they can look good and they can smell good, but they have trouble being consistent. And so you can start to flash out whether or not this person just looks good or whether or not they really can't perform. So there's magic to all of this in dealing with people who are professionals and know how to do this is going to dramatically increase your success rate. Just give some simple examples, not trying to, these are some of the handouts that you have, not necessarily an endorsement of any of these methodologies or organizations, just simply getting you in the right universe of what it is that we're talking about. Some of you maybe have never used a professional outsourced recruiter. Some of you have maybe never utilized pre-employment testing. Maybe you've never really, you just kind of sit down and shot from the hip when you've conducted an interview. I know when I've personally done that, and I have, I've had a tendency to do way too much of the talking. I've had a tendency to spend way too much of my time trying to sell the candidate on my organization, of which is important and is a component, but much more of what you're trying to get out of that is trying to determine whether or not that candidate is correct for your organization. So those are just some handouts that we have that we want to just get you familiar with what these concepts are so that you can approach them more intelligently. Now, the thing that that's going to be a recurring theme as we look at all of these is that all of these cost money. And one of the handouts that I'm hopefully, if I do a good job of time management, I'm going to save enough time for at the end, is being accountants. We really understand that to combat each one of these 5 common failure points, we're going to be asking you to consider spending money. And that as accountants, we would never ask you to do that without considering the return that you would be getting on that investment. So we have a handout at the end where we painstakingly mathematically work through how you can create an appropriate budget for a hire. to make sure that you really are getting return on investment, because we are asking you to invest in this HR cycle. You know, some of that is going to be dependent on the specific position. If the person's going to be having direct reports, if the person's going to be managing money by either managing projects or managing profit centers, then it makes sense to escalate the amount of investment that you would make in making sure that that is a successful hire. So all of those come into consideration, and again, we'll get into more of the numbers part of it later. These are some things that again, are simple, that I think we may have already alluded to. You know, have more than one person involved, ask the same basic questions. You may use your own language, your own flavor, so that it's not mechanical, but you're trying to get the same basic information, compare notes. You know, again, I think we covered that. There's some basic information about the process. Again, I'm not going to belabor that because we've got a lot to cover, but it just, again, gives you an idea of how important sequencing is to this whole thing. Just to give you a very quick one that I'll just pick out, some people do the pre-employment screening after the interview. I advocate doing the pre-employment screening before the interview, because once you've met the person, you start to compile a preconceived notion, and now you start to use those pre-screens to justify decisions that you've already made, and you start to rationalize around why somebody that you really liked may have scored poorly, or somebody who maybe you wouldn't have initially made a connection with maybe scored pretty well, but you overlook that because of some personal bias. So I actually prefer to do the pre-screen before the interview so that you don't have these built-in biases. But again, that just goes to show you all of the little art and science of this. A whole topic that we do not have time to delve into, but mercifully we've actually brought in people that are truly experts at this to speak to this, is this one other caveat that I would give you, is that another basic mistake that we make before we even make a mistake is, I guess the original mistake is hiring when we should have been outsourcing in the first place. So you know, you can avoid a bad hire by not making the hire, by outsourcing. So even the critical discussion of when you outsource versus when you hire can greatly improve your chances of making a good hire. Have the right tool for the right need. Don't hire when you should be outsourcing. So I'm going to gloss over these slides because we're going to be handling that in the second part of our presentation today. And again, that kind of deals with variable staffing, yada, yada. There's all kinds of other advantages of outsourcing, but I'm going to kind of just go through those. And there's handouts related to that. So the basic bottom line, and then we'll move on to the next sentence so we can stay on track, is that we want to hire sparingly. And when we do hire, we want to make sure that we are doing it with all of the right expertise and advice. Well, one of the things that you'll see when we get back to the nuts and bolts and the ROI is the whole idea of we want to be frugal, and I'll use that word as opposed to cheap, and we really do want to be frugal. You never want to be cheap, but you want to challenge the ROI in everything you do. But when you look back at our examples of the ROI analysis, you're going to see that one of the challenges in combating these HR sins is the costs are typically off the financial statement types of costs. So we're asking you to spend money that shows up on your financial statement to combat costs that we believe are very real and quantifiable, but they don't show up as line items. There's no line item on your financial statement for the cost of a bad hire, but that doesn't mean that that isn't a significant cost of doing business. So we're going to use examples of that later. So let's talk about the very next common failure point, and that is it's the it's the next sin in order. And to some extent, poor hiring practices set you up for failure for the next sin. Because obviously the more you improve your batting rate, your hitting rate on your hires, the less often you're going to need to face up to the fact that you've got an underperformer on your hands and you need to deal with it. But regardless of how good your batting rate is going to be, you are still going to make bad hires. You're going to make good hires where over time, either because the organization has changed and grown and the individual has not been able to keep pace, or the individual changes. They have a personal status change, and somehow they just become less productive than they used to be for reasons of which you cannot control. You are going to need to face up to the fact that you have underperformers. So, you know, when we look at some of these basic core underlying problems of why we allow underperformers to exist in our organizations too long, we find almost the exact opposite of the hiring sin when we look at kind of one of the underlying core drivers of the hiring sin is that we said we have a tendency, if we wanted to generalize, to hire too quickly, and the exact opposite is true on with the firing sin. We have a tendency to remove underperformers too slowly. Now, certainly that needs to be done appropriately, and you know, but it does need to be dealt with, and it's an easy thing to put off because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's just generally unpleasant. So what is kind of these other fundamental problems with this inability to deal with underperformers? And actually, even before I get into the fundamentals of this slide, let me just reiterate how prevalent I think that this problem is in organizations, and it may be a bigger problem for your organization than you realize. But one of the things that we're proponents of is, at a minimum, some type of annual employee survey. And just as a point of reference, GE, Jack Welch did an annual employee survey for all 20 years that he was the CEO. He asked a variety of questions, but one of the most relevant questions that he would ask to this particular topic was, he would point blank ask. The question was very straightforward. How well does GE deal with underperformers? You know, scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, whatever it was. And pretty much every year, and I actually believe every year that he gave that survey, they received the lowest marks, the worst feedback on their ability to deal with underperformers organizationally. And to put that in even further context, GE developed a reputation, particularly under Welch, as being fairly good at dealing with underperformers, and it still was the area that they scored the worst at in terms of overall employee feedback. When I was in private industry, I walked my talk and we conducted annual employee surveys. We asked that exact question. I actually lifted the question word for word out of the GE survey, and it too was traditionally, consistently, the area that we received the worst feedback on was our ability to deal with underperformers. And just another quick note, and some of this may be in slides later, and if it is, we'll go past those, but one of the reasons this is so important is that I want to connect the dots back to the opening remarks. When we said that a high-performance organization is a high-performance organization because it's made up of high-performance people, then one of the things that you really need to make sure that you're cognizant about is the connection that the drag that underperformers have on high performers. It's going to be difficult to create a high-performance organization made up of high-performance individuals if you allow underperformers to exist within your culture, because high performers don't like working with underperformers for a variety of reasons, some of them that just come down to basic equity and fairness. They don't see why they should be going above and beyond if we allow other people to not even do the basic requirements of the job. They may feel that their compensation in a vacuum would be appropriate in their position within the company. They might be very happy, and not just happy, engaged and motivated in a vacuum, but as human beings naturally compare, and they compare themselves to others, now they become disgruntled with their relative pay, not their absolute pay, but their relative pay based on their perception of their performance versus others' performances, or their status versus others' status. So over time, if not dealt with effectively and proactively, you can end up creating a fair amount of disengagement and disempowerment within your organization, and you actually turn high performers into average performers or subpar performers through not dealing with underperformers. Because if I am a high performer and I feel that I am not being equitably treated, and I am powerless to deal with the underperformer directly by either reassigning them or terminating them or changing their compensation or in some way dealing with it, then the only thing that I have power over is my own personal performance, and I get even by watering down my own performance to the point where I believe I am now equitably being treated relative to my peers. So that's a little bit of why, because sometimes we get lulled into saying, well, Joe or Jane is an underperformer. I pay them $30,000 a year. They're performing at half of their of what would be expected of the job, so it's costing me $15,000 a year. I've got bigger fish to fry. I'll deal with that next week. But if that person's performance is impacting 10 other teammates' performance and is watering down their production by 10%, therefore meaning you're down like an entire person at an effective rate of 50 to 75 grand a year, now you've got a much bigger problem than what you thought you had by just looking at that underperformer in a vacuum. When we look at some of the rest of the notes here under the firing sin, you know, some of the reasons, other ancillary benefits of rigorously, and I use rigorous because, again, we're talking about professionally dealing with underperformers in a professional way. But doing so recognizes that bringing new blood into an organization, people from different backgrounds, different, they understand different best practices, they bring some fresh perspective to the organization. Onboarding new people to the organization has real benefits. The fact that we're rigorous about underperformers also allows for opportunities for promoting from within. We're going to talk about how to properly evaluate promotions here in a minute, but certainly it opens up advancement for your pipeline and your bench. And being rigorous, it not only recognizes that we are in fact going to make hiring mistakes no matter how careful we are about that, but it also recognizes that for reasons that may be part of our problem that we can address when we talk about coaching and mentoring, or may just be things that are completely outside of our control, some teammates' performance does deteriorate over time for a variety of reasons, and that still needs to be dealt with. Really leads to this discussion of turnover and healthy turnover. And turnover is generally viewed as a negative, and certainly excessive turnover is negative and detrimental and costly. And certainly if we're getting turnover of our A players or our really high-impact players, that would be very detrimental and devastating. But you can't look at turnover in an aggregate and conclude whether or not turnover is or is not beneficial. It depends on who's being turned over and why. So we're going to, I think, take a look at that here in a second in terms of looking at it more at a more of a granular level when we're looking at how we measure turnover. So this is just another example of why we, and here's the example we had of from GE. I thought that would be in here somewhere. Another point of view, this slide brings up a good point that I didn't bring up. You know, sometimes the reason that we don't deal with underperformers is we think that we're doing something for Jane or Joe or whoever that underperformer is. In reality, we're really not. No, you know, one of the things that I always try to remind people is that when you talk to children, which is always fun to do, and you find out what their hopes and aspirations are for when they grow up, you know, typically they want to be a doctor, they want to be a lawyer, they want to be a fireman. I've never met a young person yet that when you ask them what they want to be when they grow up says, I want to be an underperformer. You know, nobody wants to be an underperformer. And just because they're an underperformer in your organization doesn't really mean that they would be an underperformer in all organizations. It just may not be a good fit for a variety of reasons. It may not be a good skill fit, it may not be a good culture fit, but pushing that person out, people, even when they know they're an underperformer, and even when they're unhappy with their job, people hate change, and they'll just come in and show up every day. And you know, frankly, a lot of times we're not only doing the organization a favor, but we're doing them a favor so that they can now move on to another organization and another position that is a better fit for them from a skill standpoint and a culture standpoint, where they can become a high-performing individual. So always have to look at that perspective as well. This is what I talked about in terms of that equity, that balancing act syndrome. This is that second and third power of the effect of underperformers. And when you look at our white paper on how to calculate ROI from investing in the HR cycle, one of the things that we point out is, you know, when we use that example of one underperformer impacting 10 other people's performance, I've read studies that have indicated that on a national basis, your workforce is roughly 2/3 engaged. So you have 1/3 disengagement. Now that could be due to a variety of things, but one of the things it could be due to is the fact that you need to better deal with underperformers. So if you really looked at 1/3 of your labor cost, or even some proportion of 1/3 of your labor cost that you could equate to this problem of not effectively dealing with underperformers, and you looked at that in terms of your other operating costs, you could see again our point that even though these are difficult to quantify, that these HR deadly sins are very costly. I will very, very briefly, because I think there's actually several slides on this, but just allude to, and I actually would encourage you to look at Jim Collins's Good to Great on the chapters on both tightness of fit and cult-like culture, and those are ways that you can deal with underperformers effectively within your organization. Tightness of fit is a proactive way to deal with underperformers, and Nucor Steel is an excellent example of that. And then cult-like culture is more of a cultural way that you impact and promote healthy turnover in your organization, and Nordstrom is the case study for that. But I will refer you to Good to Great for more detailed understanding of those concepts. One of the things that I will take a note or take a moment and talk about, because otherwise it's not self-explanatory, but it sounds horrible, particularly, fortunately I don't think too many of us are in the food services industry, but I actually encourage people to be unsanitary. And what I mean by that is sometimes we try to make our organizations too plain vanilla. We want our organization to be the kind of environment that everybody would want to work in. And I know that sounds like the thing you would want to do, but actually what you really want to do in terms of the case studies and studies that have been done and the best practices is you want to create a culture that is the right type of culture for your organization. It's perfectly okay that then you would remove a large section of society from really being an appropriate employee. I'll just refer back to that Nucor Steel example just very quickly. They would typically have 50% turnover in the first year of opening up a new plant because they were looking for very specific people it's that tightness of fit. There was a very small box you needed to fit in order to work there, and they made no apologies about it. So that's the idea of being unsanitary. It's okay to be rigorous and to be looking for very specific types of people with very specific types of attitudes and work ethics, and that is a best practice. Now, here's where we're going to talk again very briefly, and then we'll move on to the next topic to stay on point. But this whole idea that we alluded to of turnover and what is the right turnover rate. And what we really want to point out is that we don't believe that you can look at an aggregated turnover rate and say 5% turnover is good, 20% turnover is bad. If your 5% turnover was in your A players, 5% turnover is terrible. It's completely unacceptable. If 20% turnover was in your D players, then that's exactly the correct turnover rate for your organization. Because of past hiring practices or whatever the case may be is how you ended up with that many D players, but you needed that level of turnover in order to be successful. So what we want to look at is, I'm going to flip to the slide where we look at the statistics. Where are they? Okay, here we go. So sorry for flipping through several slides very quickly there, but what we really want to point out is rather than looking at an aggregated turnover rate, you want to look at the turnover rate relative to segmenting your employee base. So if you segmented your employee base into the A players, the ones that you wouldn't even think about going into the office tomorrow morning if they weren't there, the B players, who are really the up-and-comers, the future of your organization. They're really your go-to people. The C players, who are absolutely necessary. They're the bread and butter. They're going to make up the biggest share of your employment base, and they're necessary and their contributions are valuable. But individually, they would have these skill sets that would be more replaceable, more easily replaceable than those of the B players or the A players. And then the D players, those are the underperformers that certainly you're trying to improve their performance, but you're doing that in a rigorous and methodical enough manner that you are honest with yourself quickly enough in the process if they're just simply not going to be able to improve their performance to the level that is required. And then essentially you really want 100% turnover within that D employee segment because you have either moved them up to a C through appropriate coaching and mentoring that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, or you have moved them out of the organization. So that's just a little bit about turnover. We can, I'm falling a little behind my timeline that I had constructed, but I think that's going to be fine because the promotion sin, although we believe that mathematically it's one of the most devastating sins in terms of its cost, fundamentally the underlying cause for the sin and the remedial correction for the sin are extremely basic. So we can cover this fairly quickly. And what happens when you when you are guilty of the promotion sin is basically what is referred to as the Peter principle. And what the Peter principle says is that if you don't evaluate the correct criteria when you're promoting someone, you will systematically promote people to their level of incompetence. Now, that sounds maybe backwards or sounds nonsensical, but the typical practice is I take a look at how you are performing in your current job. If you are an outstanding performer in your current job, I promote you. Now, you're either an outstanding performer in that next job in which you get promoted again, or you are not an outstanding performer in that next job, and so you don't get promoted again. So you stop getting promoted when you stop becoming an outstanding performer, which is one rung above where you should have been left, where you were an outstanding performer. And if you make this mistake enough times over a long enough period of time, a high percentage of the positions in your organization end up populated with people that are one rung above where they should be in your organization to operate optimally for the organization's benefit, for their benefit, for all of their direct reports' benefits. And that is the classical illustration of the Peter Principle, where somebody ends up in the hierarchy one rung above where they should be. And then they're basically left there to flounder. That creates organizational dysfunction and ruins their careers, and I mean the collateral damage. It also then becomes potentially part of this underperformer and equity balancing act syndrome problem. So poor promotion practices can set up a lot of these other problems. So fundamentally, the good news is it's a very easy sin to stop performing. And all you have to do is start evaluating candidates for the promoted position based on the criteria of skills that are necessary for that position relative to the skills of the candidates for that position. So you really take you downplay the performance in their current position, because the skills that are necessary to excel at that current position may or may not be the same skills that are necessary for the new position. Some of them may be the same, some of them may be very different. So we evaluate the candidate not based on their performance in their current position, but on how their skills and experiences are going to map against these skill sets and prerequisites for the new position. And some of that can be done by just properly trying to match needed skills with existing skills versus historical performance. Some of it can be augmented in the same way that we talked about the hiring sin, because really a promotion is just another name for hiring from within. It's still a hire. So we would encourage you to employ the same methodology and the same structure and the same discipline to a promotion that you would a new hire. You're still going to pre-screen the person. It doesn't matter that they've already worked there. You're evaluating them against a different skill set. You're still going to interview them. You're still going to interview them rigorously in a structured manner. You still may not only post that job internally, but externally, because we talk about hiring from the wrong pool of candidates. We may have promoted the best person available from inside the organization. That doesn't mean we filled that position with the best person available. I know that hiring from within has a lot of merit because you know the person and you know their work habits, and it's motivational for people to see that there's upward mobility in the organization, but that doesn't mean that you should default to always just assuming that you're going to promote from within. So that really covers the Peter Principle and the promotion sin, both in terms of what it is, why it is that you committed organizationally, and how you can avoid committing in the future. So with that said, and with a goal to wrap up my presentation by 12:30, what we're going to do is we're going to move through the remainder of the slides on the promotion sin, which I believe I covered all. Oh, the only other thing, this actually is important. You know, we talked about it being one of the more costly sins. If you think about this whole idea that you promoted somebody one rung above where they were a high performer, you've financially hurt the organization because the person is an underperformer, or at least no better than an average performer in their current position, but you also lost a high performer out of that previous position. So that's what we refer to as the kind of the Peter Principle double whammy. And then again, the solution is just, you know, refer back to the hiring sin. Okay, so the next prerequisite to a high-performing organization is effective coaching and mentoring. So when you look at coaching and mentoring, versus all the rest of things that we've said about hiring right and being rigorous about underperformers and being careful about promotions. The thing that's unique and different about the coaching and mentoring and building the talent pipeline is that it needs to be done in real time on an everyday basis. So the example that I would use, because it's the simplest example, at least to me anyway, hopefully it'll be simpler to you, is imagine a basketball game, because that's probably the easiest place to see the interaction between, it's the easiest place to see the way effective and coaching and mentoring should be done. That isn't to say that some coaches, obviously some coaches are better than others and some coaches are more appropriate in the way they do it than others, but the basic idea of what a basketball coach does on the sidelines is the way that we should approach coaching and mentoring. Because if, pick your favorite college coach, who's the Butler coach, Brad Stevens, is that the right name? I'm not a Butler grad, so, but Brad Stevens. If all Brad did was sit on the bench and never say anything during the entire game, we would look there and say, boy, that guy's not a very good coach. It just seems like normal, right? We would just recognize that. But if we really look at our organizations, I would challenge you. We have people with direct reports that sit through the game, you know, the business day or the business week or the business month or the business year, and it may be an exaggeration to say that they do no coaching, but look at a Brad Stevens. They're coaching every play. They're not just coaching at the timeouts. Our people that have direct reports may at least coach at the timeouts, whether that's the weekly meeting or the monthly meeting or the annual offsite. But the good coaches coach at every possession. They coach in real time. They don't let things fester until the timeout, and then you know, try to go over the 10 things that were being done wrong. They address the things that are not being done correctly in real time, and they manage these things and encourage and coach and lead in real time. So that's really a good basketball coach is a great metaphor for what we should be doing. Now, why don't we do that? Because if you interviewed 10 business owners or members of senior management, they would all tell you, I think anyway, at least from my experience, that intellectually they understand this is vitally important. Building their human talent pipeline is vitally important. They know what it is that they should be doing. Why isn't that we're not doing it? So let's go ahead and try to look at why aren't we doing this. Why aren't we doing enough of this? Why aren't we doing this as effectively as we should? And again, this will vary from organization to organization. One of the reasons is that, let's go to this slide. I want to go through that. Okay, so let's get all the way here to talking about these player coaches. So why don't our coaches, and typically in our organizations, in the small to mid-market, our people are not merely managers. They also work and manage. So they're what I would call a player coach. So why don't our player coaches, on average, generally do as much coaching as we would really like them to? Part of this goes back to that promotion sin. We may have promoted people into player coach roles that didn't really have the skill sets to succeed as a player coach. So part of the coaching and mentoring problem is a problem we create when we promote the wrong people to having direct reports. A second part of it is that even if we are able to successfully promote people who have some of those skill sets that are necessary, we may or may not invest enough in them in really ongoing training and education and development of their coaching skills. Different people are going to have different levels of innate ability to be able to do that, and even if they have some basic core underlying skill sets for that, that doesn't mean that we still don't owe them a tremendous amount of ongoing development of their coaching and mentoring skills. The second thing, so first of all, we've got to select the right people. Secondly, we've got to give them the right training. Thirdly, we've got to hold them accountable. But also, we've got to be very careful about not setting these people up for failure. I want to get to the right slide about that. this is some points I've made previously. Well, I'm not going to worry about where it is on the slides, but one of the other things that we sometimes do with our player coaches is we may set them up for failure. So let's just say that we promoted the right person and we've given them the right training, but they're still not being a successful player coach, or at least to the extent that we believe. Well, one of the ways that we can also organizationally set people up for failure is not properly recognize, if I have a player coach, how much of their time is going to be spent on playing and how much of their time is going to be spent on coaching. So if you use Pareto's law, I would think the minimum amount of time somebody that has direct reports should be spending on coaching and mentoring would be 20%, the 80-20 rule. They should be spending 20% of their time at a minimum on what is going to yield them 80% of their results, which is coaching and mentoring. But if we have given them a set of job duties for the player side of their player coach role that takes up 100% of their available 50-hour executive work week, then it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that they're not effectively coaching and mentoring. So we have got to make sure we don't set our player coaches up for failure by either promoting the wrong people, not giving them the appropriate ongoing coaching and training and development to be good player coaches, and not allowing them sufficient time, and then, of course, holding them accountable to doing what it is they need to do. So those are the basic functional areas of coaching and mentoring. I want to do two things in our remaining time. One of them is I want to very briefly talk about the kind of the burnout sin. This doesn't require a lot of time, and there's just a few slides on it. Fundamentally, this is the culmination of all the rest of the sins. If you work backwards and you say, organizationally, we really need to improve our hiring practices. We really have not done a good enough job getting the talent that we need in. And then secondarily, we haven't been as rigorous about weeding out underperformers. Thirdly, we have occasionally been guilty of the Peter principle and the promotion sin, and we really haven't coached and managed our pipeline like we should, and we don't really have a deep bench. Then you're going to end up with a relatively small number of A players that you continually go back to and back to and back to. You keep going to the well and expecting more and more and more of them. They're too often accommodating, because that's the basic personality of a high-performing individual who wants to do right by you and the organization, until you ultimately, just because of physical and emotional capacities that human beings have, we ultimately end up breaking them down, and we take somebody that was an A player and we make them into a C or D player. So again, when you start looking at the magnitude and the costliness of these sins, converting a former A player into a C or a D player has got to be massively up there in the list of things that costs you money and that you need to be on the lookout for, because you need to proactively protect those A players, because they are a lot of times their own worst enemies and just keep taking on more and more and more. The other thing that I want to highlight before we introduce our next presenters is of all of the handouts, I think the most important handout, whoops, what have I done? Okay, we'll go one. I'm getting good coaching and mentoring from my marketing partner. Okay, it's this HR deadly sin discussion question. What we have tried to do there as accountants, again, is gone back and taken every one of these sins in turn, and we give you, actually, hopefully, what we intended to do is give you chapter and verse, essentially a recipe that you can sit down with your management team and you can work through mathematically, not just all these generic examples of what I'm alluding to, but in your organization. Have you been committing these sins? What have these sins been costing you? What would be an appropriate ROI-based budget that you could afford to invest in order to remediate that sin? How should you go about assigning champions and deadlines and timelines and follow-ups? Gives you a complete planning and execution white paper on how you can go about constructively analyzing your organization and its relevance or irrelevance to these various assorted sins. So I wanted to make special note of that. With that, it is 12:30, and so I'm going to hand it back over to Ken Hedlund, who is going to introduce our next presenters. And I, again, very much appreciate your participation on the call.
Thank you, Howard. Actually, we have one question we would like to ask you.
I'd be glad to.
And I think it's a good one, so I hope this is something that you can comfortably address. And I think this is something that we often see, but basically the gist of the question is a long-time employee with the company, maybe since the company started, at one time was a high performer, but for whatever reason is now mediocre and a low performer. What are your suggestions on how to deal with that?
Well, like most organizational challenges, the best way to deal with it is head on and with complete candor. I think, again, professionally, obviously, but I think that's the exact discussion that you need to have with, Jane or Joe is, historically, we would have rated you, at least a B player, maybe even an A player, and you can couch that or present that in whatever way is appropriate in your culture, but, you were a go-to person, whatever the extent may be, and over time, that has become less true. And I think in order to really allow that person an opportunity and really free that up, I think you can certainly originally assume that it's something that you have done organizationally that has led to that. And you can just kind of open that up by saying, Joe or Jane, why is that? What have we done that has created that environment and kind of caused that to happen? Because it could be you either promoted the person to a position that they no longer excel at, or that you haven't been rigorous enough in weeding out other underperformers, or that they don't feel like you've really invested in them appropriately over the years. So I would certainly address it. You cannot not address it. But I would address it with the assumption that there's something that you guys have done that you can fix to try to help to get the person back on track. If based on that feedback you do some things and the performance doesn't improve, now you've got a different discussion to have because you've done the right thing organizationally and you've attempted to remediate that situation, because obviously you have years and years and dollars invested in that person at a financial level, let alone a human level, that I think you need to give them the benefit of the doubt. But it absolutely has to be addressed and addressed sooner the better.
Okay, great. Thank you, Howard. We appreciate your expertise as it relates to HR, human resource topics, and the 7 deadly sins. Howard's contact information is in your slide deck, but I hate to indicate that based on Howard's expertise, we've made the decision to let Howard go today.
Yeah.
But that's actually my big attempt at some humor for a webinar. But the next topic is a very important one and a very timely one as it relates to permanent versus temporary labor. And for the majority of you that are contractors on the webinar today, something that you've been dealing with a lot here in the last several years as part of an ongoing business decision on how to staff your companies. I'm going to call it Team Ryan. We have Ryan Ellis and Ryan Boyer. They are business partners and owners of PLS of Indiana, LLC. Between the two of them, they have 24 years of experience specifically in the construction industry as well as industrial staffing industry. They have extensive experience in sales, recruiting, HR, and management nationwide in the staffing industry. They have both been actively involved in Associated Builders and Contractors for the past 14 years. Ryan Ellis is currently a national and state board member as the chairman-elect for 2012 for ABC of Indiana, will be the state chairman for Indiana in 2013. Ryan Boyer has been actively involved in both ABC of Illinois and the membership chairman, and currently involved in the communication committee for ABC of Indiana. So you can tell that their commitment to the industry is one that goes without, less of effort there. And their involvement with contractors and the contractor associations has given them the opportunity to learn and gather information about the pros and cons of utilizing permanent versus temporary labor in the construction and industrial industries. So therefore our topic today, and we welcome Ryan and Ryan and their presentation on permanent versus temporary labor. So we're going to turn it over to Ryan Ellis first.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. I definitely appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank Howard. What a great presentation. And I want to piggyback on what Howard, the theme of the presentation that he just delivered was building a high-performance organization. And a part of that, and what we're going to focus on, is building and maintaining a high-performance workforce and focus more on the decisions that contractors or industrial companies make in, do I hire permanently or do I use a temporary labor source to help me through those peaks and valleys, and looking at those objectively, how do those impact my bottom line, both in the short run and the long. So let's get right into it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at both permanent and temporary, and we're going to look at what are my costs and what are my exposures. And as I go through that, we'll kind of do a comparison and we'll take a look at it. But right off the bat, as a manager, what are my costs and exposures when I make a permanent hire? What does it cost me to truly put feet on the ground? What potential liabilities come with making a new hire? And how do those new hires impact my bottom line in the short run and in the long run? Let's just dive right into this. So what are my true costs of making a permanent hire? What process do we go through to actually get feet on the ground? And that process typically starts with running ads, sifting through resumes, conducting interviews, doing reference and background checks, drug screens and physicals, safety training and orientations, and then following up what PPE, what tools, uniforms, etc. do you equip that individual with prior to them starting work for you in the field. And what we've done over the years is talk to a lot of contractors, talk to a lot of individuals, and both internally and externally, okay, what does that cost me? And what I want to go through next is, okay, let's take a look at, these costs may vary, per company, maybe more, maybe less, but let's just kind of look at some numbers and let's dollarize what we're talking about here. So the cost of running ads, and whether that's the traditional method, putting ads in the paper, the Indianapolis Star, I know a lot of us are getting away from that, but what is the cost to put an ad in Monster? What's the cost to utilize Career Builder? And those are annualized costs typically because they want you to sign on for a year contract for that. Craigslist right now is one of the only free opportunities that we have to post, but a lot of times you get the least amount of results. If you're running a bonus program or referral program, there is a cost. And what we did is basically that is anywhere from $400 a week. It could be more, it could be less, but what we found is about $400 a week. Secondly, that second circle, conducting interviews. And we based this off a $50,000 a year position, whether that's an HR director, whether that's an owner, whether that's a manager, an operations manager. But if you break that down and you look at that you're averaging 8 to 12 interviews per new hire, sometimes it can take a heck of a lot more than that. But just using those numbers at $25 an hour times 10 interviews, you're about $250 there. Reference checks and background checks. Howard touched on that. It's critically important whether you do it pre-interview or post-interview. You have to check references. You have to make sure that that individual has worked where he said he's worked and to get some quality references back in doing so. And background checks, to actually do a background check. Those can run anywhere from $50 to $100. It depends on who you're using. But between the $25 per hour for that same HR manager and the cost of doing the background checks, we put about $175 per new hire. Drug screens and physicals. I know it's very big in the ABC, it's very big with contractors, a pre-employment drug screen. A lot of the work that we did in Illinois, we even piggybacked that with we're going to do a physical examination to make sure that they are physically fit enough to do the work that is required. So could be higher, could be lower, but on average we're running about $150 per new hire for drug screens and physicals. Safety training, especially in construction, whether it's construction or industrial, there is specific safety training that organizations use. At a minimum of, a 10-hour OSHA training. Some companies do it pre-employment, some do it post-employment, but at some time that new hire will go through some type of safety training. And also a new hire orientation. That new hire orientation is, here's the company you're coming to join, these are the rules, the regulations, and a lot of times, if they do it correctly, they should be really emphasizing job site specific safety issues as well. So about $150 per new hire there. And then lastly, PPE, personal protective equipment, hard hats, safety glasses, gloves, harnesses are easily right there. You could rack up $375. Tools that may be required that are given to that new individual. And then obviously uniforms and everything else that goes with equipping that individual to do the position. So we come up with what we found historically, both internally as a company and externally with a lot of the contractors that we work with, about $1,500 per new hire, and that is before boots even hit the ground, before you can bill or start receiving income from that individual's efforts. Okay, so those are kind of your hard costs right up front before you bill one. Sent to your customer or to your client. Those are an investment that you make in that individual. Now let's look at potential exposures to think about before making permanent hiring decision. And these are what are really wide open because it's hard to put a dollar amount to. It's different for every company, but these are the unforeseen costs that can really impact your bottom line. So workers' comp, unemployment insurance, healthcare, productivity, and legal. So let's dig right into workers' comp. Probably one of the scariest things I know as a business owner, keeps me up at night, but one of the things that we have to absolutely look at as PLS as an organization and the contractors that we work with is because when you make that permanent hire, the first day on the job is typically the most critical when you're responsible for that individual's safety. And what we found is that first 90 days of employment are typically when accidents can happen because they're brand new and they're getting used to working with you as a company and also your job sites. But historically, that's when you're most exposed. Secondly, a cost were workers' comp. Circumstances such as jobs nearing completion or winter rolling around. Contractors are more likely to see an increase in injuries. If an individual knows that they're going to be laid off, if they're going to be laid off for 2 or 3 months, unfortunately, there has been incidents where they fake injuries because it pays a lot more than being on unemployment. Many times these injuries can end up being 4 and 5 times the cost of the initial injury. So if you're spending $5,000 just to fix the injury, to get a finger sewed up or a tendon that was cut because of doing something careless, and where I got that information is Safety Management Group. They have a very good injury cost calculator that is very good at explaining how the initial cost of the injury, when you add into the investigation process, the follow-up process, dealing with that individual, being on light duty, a lot of times that $5,000 bill can end up being a $25,000 to $30,000 exposure. Unemployment exposure. When you decide to make that permanent hire, you are on the ropes to make sure that you can keep that individual 100% productive year-round, 52 weeks, 50 weeks out of the year. So every time you make a new hire or bring back an employee that you will have to lay off again, it negatively impacts your SUTA rates for the next 3 years. We've just, we're on the rebound coming out of a recession. We've all known that probably unemployment rates are the highest they've ever been. And one of the things that contractors need to think about is when I make those new hires, I'm at that new higher unemployment rate for those individuals that we're bringing in. So with that problem of increasing unemployment rate, contractors need to do everything they can to keep their exposure to that in check. Healthcare exposure. This one drives me crazy too. But annual medical trends, an increase of 15 to 20% annually on premiums in Indiana. And that is directly from our insurance provider. And if any of you have been in business long enough, you dread the renewals on your health insurance. So that is an exposure that you, as you increase your workforce permanently, thus that 15 to 20% you can look at with those individuals that you have to have health care coverage. You know, as Howard mentioned earlier, those A players are not going to come to work for you and stay working for you unless you provide those benefits. So that increased premium cost per hire is an exposure that you need to think about. The exposure of hiring an employee or dependent with an illness. That is something that we cannot discriminate against. That's something that we cannot, it's not something that we look for up front, but it does happen. I mean, if you hire somebody or somebody that has a dependent that is ill, it affects that pool of workers, which will drive your cost up. And then lastly, compliance with healthcare reform, regulation, and compliance. That's an exposure with HIPAA regulations, with COBRA regulations. There's a lot of things that you need to think about and things that you must do in order and timely to make sure that you're meeting those specifications. And if not, there are fines and things that come with that. That is an exposure. Productivity exposure. Typically, contractors sacrifice profits paying for unbillable wages when their labor exceeds their immediate job site needs. We've seen it. We've talked to contractors many times about, well, we spent $1,500 just using our cost example. We spent a lot of money. We invested in this individual. We're going to do everything we can to keep him busy. And every time I hear that word busy, it just resonates through my whole body. We got to think about keeping them productive, and what productive means is you're actively billing for those hours. So supervisors have the disadvantage is that their owner, their HR manager, their hiring person spend a lot of time and effort to find this individuals, and supervisors in the field have the disadvantage that they do not have the ability to increase or decrease the number of workers on a daily basis. We see it all the time where job A has 5 employees, job B has 5 employees. Job A finishes up, those 5 employees roll over to job B. So you have a job that was getting completed with 5 employees, now there's 10. It kills the overall productivity of that job site, and you're carrying 5 people that you're basically not billing for. That's an exposure that you got to think about. Legal exposure, probably one that hopefully, if we're doing things correctly, you don't see a lot of, but holy cow, is there not a cap on that one. And wrongful termination charges, NLRB charges, you hear about it all the time, sexual harassment charges, gross negligence. That's a biggie, and I don't even know how you put a dollar amount on that other than just keep yourself out of it. But that is an exposure every time you decide to make a permanent hire. Okay, now let's switch gears, and let's talk about what are my costs and exposures when utilizing, if we make a decision at an owner level, at a management level, that we're going to consider outsourcing. And let's compare those same things. What are my costs? What are my exposures? What we try to do, and what we do as an organization, and we work with contractors to do, is to figure out, what is my total cost for that individual. And if you're bidding projects, your estimators know, what you've got to work with. It's something we go through with contractors, and we just use this example as a carpenter in Indiana. You've got your FICA, your FUTA, and an administrative cost. That is very flexible depending upon your organization. But just for this example, we use $1.50. You've got your SUTA we talked about, and a lot of the contractors, especially right now, are at the higher end of that scale just because of the unemployment that we're just now getting people back to work. Workers' comp, that is just kind of an average for Indiana for a workers' comp premium for a carpenter. It may flex depending on your company. And From that, you come at a benefits that are offered for your company. We use around $3 per hour. So you get to a subtotal of $26.22. And then with that, you've got to take that $26.22 times 80 hours a week, divided by 50, divided by 40 to get what is my true cost for that vacation. So that's where we come up with that $1.05 per hour that you would put in there for vacation, because typically what we see is anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks of vacation, but just on average we use that 2-week vacation to come to a total cost of that employee per hour is $27.27. What we've put on here is an hourly temporary bill-out rate. This is what you can probably look for, maybe more, maybe less, but on average about a $32 an hour bill-out rate if you're utilizing that same carpenter, that $18 an hour carpenter, and you're getting them from a temporary labor provider. So I get all the time, especially when I was new in the business, is that, what's my rate going to be for a carpenter? And I'd say $32 an hour. Oh my God, I'm not paying anybody $32 an hour. What, are you crazy? Well, okay, obviously let's go back to this sheet here. So when you subtract that, you're actually, when I tell contractors now, what am I going to pay for a carpenter? You're going to pay about $4.73 per hour. So you're looking at about $200 a week to utilize that carpenter on an as-needed basis when the need arises. So what is my cost of utilizing a temporary worker in that situation? $4.73 per hour. Okay. Now show me the value, and this is just some things that we run through that talks about possible advantages of utilizing a temporary workforce. And we look at, in the previous slides, we talked about $1,500 cost to bring that individual in before their boots even hit the ground. That $1,500, if you divide that by 473, which is the cost per hour of that temporary worker, we tell contractors and industrial institutions all the time, you have 317 hours, billable hours of work with no risk. And I'll get into that here in just a second about the risk, but there's no workers' comp risk because that workers' comp risk goes to the temporary provider. There's no unemployment risk because that risk goes to the temporary provider. They are responsible for keeping that individual working. And your legal risk is dramatically reduced. I can't say that it's completely removed, but it's dramatically reduced. So you have 317 hours to utilize this individual before you even hit that threshold of the $1,500 that you would have spent day one before you even know on day two they're not going to work out. And then you start that whole process over again. Another way that we look at this, which was the example of productivity, and this is a big one. When you try to compare apples to apples, when you spend time, effort, and you get an A player, the last thing you want to do, you can't work A players, lay off A players, because they will not stick around. So what we typically do is we hold on to them. There are times when we pay A players and we are not directly billing for their time. And that's one thing I wanted you to take a look at too. Take that $27.27, which is your cost per hour for that employee. And if you're so great that you can match your workforce with your workload on a daily basis, well, let's say that you mess up for one day, and they work one day where you're not billing for them. It's $218 for that day. And I go back to your cost for that temporary worker would be $200 per week. So it's just something to think about. And we try to get people to understand and how to dollarize when you look at permanent versus temporary. Okay, so what are my potential exposures of utilizing a temporary employee? Well, we talked about the legal exposure is dramatically reduced, so it's in gray. Workers' comp is gone. Your workers' comp exposure is not there because if that employee is hurt on your project, the workers' comp is carried by the temporary labor provider. Unemployment insurance exposure is gone. If that individual is finished with your project and that temporary company doesn't have another project to put them on and they're drawing unemployment, they're drawing unemployment from that temporary provider, not from you. The healthcare exposure is gone, because that temporary labor provider, some do, some don't, provide medical insurance, but that healthcare exposure that we talked about on the previous slides falls onto that temporary labor provider and not on you. So what are you left with? Well, you're left with general liability, and you have that regardless. You have that whether you hire the individual permanently or you outsource that responsibility to a temporary labor provider. The general liability is basically supervision. If that temporary worker, if that permanent worker drives the backhoe through the side of the building and it's $2,000 worth of damage, that falls under your general liability policy, and that's an exposure that you have regardless. And then lastly, productivity is a responsibility of the supervisor on site. So that productivity exposure you still have with utilizing temporary labor. The supervisor needs to make sure all workers are productive individually and as a team. However, and here's the big however, the supervisor now has the advantage of adjusting his workforce on a daily, weekly basis. So you're paying a premium for those services. You're paying $5 an hour a premium for those services. You're going to have a heck of a lot less time cutting that worker, because you know if that worker comes off a job, they're going to be placed somewhere else. And also, there's not the connection. Very typically, supervisors are friends. They're family a lot of times with these individual workers on the job. There's not that emotional connection that if I let Bob go today, I know his wife, I know his children, he's not going to have anywhere to go tomorrow. They partner with that temporary provider, and they know that when that individual is released, that they're going to be placed on another project. Okay, so let's go through outsourcing versus direct hire. Let's just do the Socratic method, the pros versus cons. We've talked about the pros of outsourcing versus direct hire. Reduced legal exposure. We talked about that exposure of making a bad hire, wrongful termination, no unemployment exposure. That exposure is shifted over to the temporary labor provider. No workers' comp exposure. And these are big exposures, and it's very difficult. And outside of historical data that you have within the company, that workers' comp exposure is the one that, like I said earlier, is the one that keeps me up at night. It's probably the big exposure that you have as a contractor. Another pro is giving you the ability to adjust that workforce on a daily basis. And it's not that it's adjusted daily. What I've seen, it's adjusted weekly. But when you're paying that premium, you're billing for that. You're billing for that premium. So it does a much better job of matching up that you're only working this individual when they're productively working, which means you're actively billing for that time. And then lastly, increased productivity for workers through the end of the job. Historically, what we've seen is that it happens, it's a dynamic that happens on a job when employees, your employees, are on a project, they know that there's a month left, they know there's 2 weeks on this project. Even good employees have a natural tendency to slow down. That productivity goes down on the job overall because they know once that 2 weeks is done, once that 4 weeks is done, they're out of work and they're on unemployment. So naturally, they have a tendency to slow down. That dynamic is gone when utilizing a temporary labor provider. Those employees know when that project specific is done in 2 weeks that they've got another job to go to. So that dynamic, I'm not saying that it's not there, but it's significantly decreased because when that project's finished, they go on to work with another contractor. And typically in the industry, these employees are told that if they get to 8 to 10 contractors that they work with on an ongoing basis, or they get to an A list, that they can keep themselves productively working 52 weeks out of the year because they're kind of dispersing their eggs into multiple baskets. They're not relying on one individual contractor to keep them working 52 weeks out of the year. Okay, let's talk about the cons. Let's talk about what possibly could be a negative of utilizing a temporary labor provider, or if you decide to outsource. One of the big ones is availability. What happens if you're needing 10 carpenters and you need them on Monday, you call your temporary labor provider and guess what? They don't have it. That is something that you need to think about. I would suggest that the more time that you give them, the better, but that is a concern, and that's a concern that we've heard from contractors and people that we've worked with. How do I know you're going to have these individuals when I need them? And then, secondly, the temporary worker integration with permanent workforce. And this is probably one of the big ones that we hear over and over again, and that is simply buy-in. From the very top of an organization to management, to the supervisors in the field, to the other employees in the field, how do you integrate a temporary workforce? How do you integrate a variable workforce into a permanent workforce with its own culture, its own safety standards? How do you treat those temporary workers with the permanent workers? Because it directly will impact productivity of those temporary workers. If they are treated, and I hate the word just because I'm in the industry, as temporary, if they are treated as temporary, they're treated differently, it's not going to work. It has to be a buy-in from the top. It has to be a buy-in from the management, the supervisors, and more importantly, the workers in the field have to buy into it as as a management. Okay.
Well, I just want to chime in here for a minute. This is something that it's probably the hardest part of the partnership. It's hard to sometimes explain as an owner to your company. Maybe it's the first time you've ever outsourced. Why you're outsourcing. The thing that I can tell you is the easiest thing is I say, hey, bring in your labor provider and let them explain it in the terms of it's job security, number one, for your employees. You're making a determination. All the guys that you keep, this is my core group, and you're going to invest as much time, effort, training, benefits that you can into keeping a smaller group, because if you grow by 15 or 20 and have to provide all those benefits, then obviously we know how costly that is. It's much more difficult to provide the better benefits the larger you get. So if your guys understand that the outsourcing is creating job security for them, provided that they are, as Howard said earlier, one of your A, B, or C players. Now, if they're D players, then they should worry, because your labor provider should be able to provide you with more A, B, and C level guys to replace some of those Ds with just when you need them. But the A's, B's, and C's, they need to understand they can remain productive, don't drag the jobs out, and they should partner and treat the guys well as equals on the job, because those outsourced guys are helping create job security for those permanent employees that you said you're going to keep as your core group. I just want to make sure that we didn't skip past that.
Thank you, sir. Key factors to consider when selecting a temporary labor provider. Something that you should look at is look at their safety standards. Huge. Just because they're responsible for the workers' comp, you're responsible for the management and supervision of that job site, protecting your EMR. Something you should definitely look at. The types of services provided. Are they more of a specialty in the next bullet point? What types of services do they provide? And then also, what are their areas of specialty? Some temporary labor providers that they call and say, hey, I need a labor for a day. Well, that's not what we do. Or I need a welder. They may not, their specialty may not be welders. Something you need to think about. Review their hiring process. Are they labor consultants? Are they not? And then more importantly, and what I mean by that, are they just going to be somebody that you can call on a Thursday to get individuals on a Friday? Are they actually going to come in and consult with you as a company? How does that integrate? How is it going to work? What dollarizing that value to you? So it's kind of like outsourcing that HR director. And do they have the capability to do that as an organization? And then, obviously, and Howard hit on that earlier, check their references. Call around to their current customers, call around and see how they are doing, and if they are following all those above bullet points.
And one thing that I know with our company and some of the places that we work, it's a regular request for our EMR. It's a regular request for our OSHA 300 logs. I would recommend that you make that part of your investigation of their safety, because you are in the end entrusting their workers with carrying out your policies, procedures, and your work. need to make sure that they're sharing sharing the same value when they're out there putting their name on some of your work.
Absolutely. The last slide, and then I think we have a couple questions here. So what are the benefits of partnering? And that's what I would strongly encourage you to do, is when you find a labor provider that you're comfortable with, truly create a partnership with them. When you do that, and Howard spoke of this earlier, and I emphatically agree with him, it allows you to focus on what your core competency is, and that is bidding carpentry jobs, and that is managing carpentry projects, and that is completing them on time, under budget, and with a lot of safety involved in that. Focus on what you're good at. Focus the sifting through 100 resumes to someone else. Secondly, decreasing or eliminating exposures. As a business owner myself, the more you can do that, the better. That is a huge benefit of partnering. Lowering your costs, lowering your cost per hire, and increasing your productivity. Those are our two big ones, is that we've talked about A, B, and C players. What if you could eliminate your C players and outsource that to a labor provider that has an increased productivity coming with those individuals? Something you need to think about. Increased business opportunity. Labor providers typically are in the know of all the projects that are going on. They are very good at networking their clients with other clients to create jobs. And then lastly, the consulting aspect of it. Are they truly a consultant? Are they just somebody to call and request people when you need extra bodies for a project? Do they truly work with you to create that balance between permanent versus temporary? What are my fixed employees look like compared to what my variable employees look like?
Make one comment here before you take the questions, before you wrap it up. On the increased opportunity for business part, if you find a good partner and they've got, and you're an electrical contractor and they have 150 electricians that work for them, and at any given time they've got 15 or 20 of those guys available, or they have the ability to ramp up to 200 if necessary. A lot of times I see contractors, they don't think of that temporary labor provider as a separate division of their business. They only think of them when they actually land a job or they're short guys, and then they pull from them, as opposed to a core way of business thinking, hey, I don't have 30 electricians in my company. I have access to another 100 through that labor provider. But if you communicate well with them, you should know at all times how many they have available. Your project managers, your estimators should know what they have access to, so they're not just trying to bid enough work to keep your guys working. Because a lot of times, as an owner, you may want to grow, and they think their job is to keep 30 guys working. That's what they're going to shoot for, and you may not land that one or two extra jobs throughout the year that can make all the difference in your bottom line, year end.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Well, we do have a couple questions. So the first one is, how do you maintain an A-team culture invested in the company with temporary workers? And I think this is all one question. So first is, how do you maintain an A-team culture with temporary workers? And then temporary equals disposable among permanent workers, and then performance variability. So I think there's a lot of moving parts to that question. But
Well, I'll try this one. The first part, when it comes to the A players, speaking just in terms of how we recruit at PLS, it's very simple. I don't have to employ 200 guys because that's how much work that we've got. We will interview as many guys as we can. When we find an A player, we'll bring them on board. We're consistently upgrading our workforce as well. We're not perfect. We make bad hires too. Even checking references, we'll find out that we may check 5 references on a guy. They all came back good. We put him out to work, and he's still not up to the standards of what we've got. We don't have to keep that individual because the project requires it. We keep them as long as they're of the quality. When we hire them, we tell them, and I suggest you do this too, if you ever do have to hire for your core group, you tell them, hey, this is what it takes to be a team member here. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that maintaining that A-player mentality is that worker integration that we just talked about. That is so key, because you cannot, and I would tell you not to do it. Don't use a temporary labor provider if you're going to treat them as such. If you do not, from the top down, and sit your employees down and say, this is a business decision, this is how we're going to move forward, and these are the cost savings. When we have profit sharing at the end of the year, it's going to be shared with 30 people, not with 50, because we've decided to implement this into our company. If you go through that process, and I used to do it, dollarize that process to the individual. And if your labor provider is doing that with their employees, I talked about maintaining that A culture. You have to do your part on your side. The labor provider has to do it on his side. Those individuals that work for a temporary company know that they have to act as if this is their company when they're on that project. Because if they don't take that ownership as an employee would, they're not going to be asked back. The way that they maintain 52 weeks of work is they do that 8 to 10 times with different contractors. That's how you maintain that A-player mentality, is that you have to make sure the culture is there to accept it, and you have to make sure that that individual, and that's what we have to do. We have to make sure that that individual understands when you go to that job site, they're paying a premium for you. You have to be productive. They have to, when they're finished with you after 4 to 5 weeks, they better know your name, and they better say, put him on our A list. That's how we do it.
And that's the other part about, earlier we were talking about productivity. Towards the end of a job, if our pros are on preferred lists with 10 different contractors, when the job's coming to an end, your job's going to end, you notify us a week or two ahead. You say, hey, we're going to be slowing down. We're going to drop your guy off. That's awesome, because he's going to work hard through the very last day, so he's on your preferred list the next time you need him. He's not worried about getting laid off because he doesn't just depend upon you to keep him working. He works for PLS or works for whatever labor provider you use. It's that company's responsibility to make sure he's got his next job lined up. So they work hard through the end. The company should work hard to make sure he's got his next job. So he works year-round. A lot of labor providers do provide good benefits. Those that don't, I'm sure they do struggle, with some of the turnover of the top guys, because I know for us, you have to be able to provide those things in order to recruit and retain the top guys.
Great answer. I think you guys covered all the aspects of that question. One last question, and we'll wrap up. When using temporary labor, such as your company provides within a trade and skill level, how does complying with prevailing wage-based and fringe requirements, as well as certified payroll, how does that work?
That's a great question. What we do as a company, and I can tell you that it is different. It is different across the board. Some temporary labor providers simply pay out the wage and the fringe to that employee. What we've decided to do is we utilize the fringe benefit group, which is through the Associated Builders and Contractors, which allows us to pay the pay the wage to that employee. If it's $13 an hour for a helper, that $8.65 of a fringe is tax deferred into basically a 401k account with the fringe benefit group. We take it even a step further, where there's the ABC training trust, where you can separate out monies from that that can be utilized for training. So what we've done as a company is a lot of what contractors do, and we take advantage of that tax savings instead of paying it all out as a wage. It makes us competitive with our contractors because we can pass that cost savings on to them.
So we are responsible for the certified payroll. We
Yes.
produce our own weekly on basis.
Yep, absolutely, and exactly right. I mean, that certified payroll would be the responsibility of that temporary labor provider. A lot of times I have to send originals. I drop them off. I mail them. Sometimes PDFs are fine. It just really depends on the contractor, but they should have the ability to do that. That probably should have been a bullet point, something you should look for, but that's a great question, because in the past, not all labor providers did that.
Great. What a great presentation. Thank you, Ryan and Ryan, with PLS. And their contact information you can see on the screen. Just one comment on closing. I do want to recognize our other sponsors, Associated Construction Publications. If you are not subscribing to their publications, we encourage you to do so. You can access that online and subscribe. The local publication is Construction Digest. I do want to mention John White and Jill Paskoff. They are the owners of Associated Construction Publications and very active in the industry. I'm sure many of you know them. So thank you for your time. We will issue our next series here probably within the next month, and it'll be full of good information as it relates to the construction industry, and we appreciate everyone's participation.